science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. It's the summer of 2022 and I am on a summer-like schedule, releasing episodes every 2 to 3 weeks, and I hope you will enjoy today's conversation that I'm having with the architect Hiroshi Okamoto, who had his training at Cornell and then later at MIT, who then went on to work in Japan for a while, but then cut his teeth working closely with IM Pei in his last years. After that, he established his own practice in partnership, and he has done a number of projects which are very interesting, and mostly I concentrate on a museum he has done for the Chinese painter and activist Mu Xin. And after that, I will talk to him about a project that he worked closely with Richard Serra for his London Cross project in upstate Connecticut. It's an interesting conversation, and we learn a little bit about his practice, and I try and get into his ideas about lineage and how to transform history into architecture form. I hope you enjoy. Here we go. Well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Hiroshi. Such a pleasure to have you here on this podcast. I have been following your work online, your various awards, and the things that you and your partners have been doing at OLI in New York. But of course, I realized when looking at your bio, looks like we were in upstate New York, in Ithaca, together at the same time. At Cornell. I was there from 86 to 93. You went to Cornell? What year did you graduate?
Well, that's right. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. As you noticed, we overlapped. I was in the BArt program, and that was a 5-year program, and I graduated in 92. So it was 87 to 92.
Right. And then you worked for a while.
The peak of Cornell.
Peak of Cornell, yeah. Val Work was there, Jerry was there, Guillaume Delajun, Guillaume Fuente was there. Even Colin Rowe was still there.
Colin Rowe was still
there. Matt Bell was there. I worked mostly in history theory with Mark Jarzambek and then with Dominic LeCapra across in McGraw. I don't know if you ran into him.
Yeah. Not much, but I had Mark as a professor, one of my favorite history classes. So
yes, wonderful. No, I had Mark too, and then Mark and I became very good friends and collaborators. So we have published a bunch of books. That's so I'm glad we have this Cornell background, and as I looked at your work, and I'm sure you're going to deny this, but the Cornell imprint is still there in your work. But I'll come to that in a minute.
Sure. It's a big lens.
It's a big lens. But I see that you from Cornell, then you went on and you worked in Japan for a while.
Yes, for 5 years.
For 5 years, and then you started working closely with IM Pei, I think, for
that's right.
About a decade or so, 10, 12 years, right? Right till the end of his career in life, yeah?
That's right. So I was in Japan, and then it was only supposed to be a short 2 years or so, because I grew up mostly in the States. I was born in Japan. Yeah. But I met my wife there, future wife, and then 2 years turned out to 4, then 5, and I realized I had to leave or I would never leave. So I applied to graduate schools and decided I wanted to go to MIT from my visits to all these schools, and it was a very exciting time as well, and computation, design, design technology. Course, and they have a fantastic SM Arc. So it's a science of Master of Science in Architecture.
Oh yeah, fantastic SM Arc. Yes. Great. Okay, so that's how you came back to the US.
Yes.
And I know Mark must have moved to MIT by that time, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Then you joined IM Pei.
Yes. So out of school, I was looking actually in Japan. To tell you the truth, I wasn't the biggest fan of IMP work
Oh,
until I
really?
visited the Miho Museum. And I
Uh-huh.
always loved the National Gallery, and the Louvre was the Louvre.
Of course, yeah.
But I wasn't drawn to his architecture so much until I visited the Miho Museum. Miho Museum, I don't know if you've ever been to
I have not.
Japan or yeah,
Yeah,
fantastic building, great
yeah.
client. He had 3 projects with him, and the last one I worked on as well, which is the chapel for the school that they built. But the museum was something that when I look back, we would do these Cornell summer programs. Remember Chuck Pierman? He was a professor in the architecture
Yeah,
program. Chuck was very much, he had a long history at Cornell. And in his later years, he became a devout Quaker and he loved Japan. He would visit, very interested in Japanese architecture, Japanese modernism. And him and if you remember Lenny Mirren, he
yeah,
was a
yeah, yeah,
landscape professor.
yeah.
They would run their summer program from
Oh,
Cornell. And for those of you who don't know, there's a 2-year, it's kind of a full semester credit. And it's a traveling summer program looking at architecture and doing a lot of work in sketchbooks, but having kind of a full design studio with these
okay.
little design boards. And we would go and do these things. And I did it as a student, and then I did it as a TA 1 year. And then as I was living in Japan, they asked me to do it again, especially when I was moving back. And
I
this
see.
is a time, that I went to visit, and we would live in Kyoto for a month, get that basis of kind of the traditional cultural Japan. And then we would travel around and end up in Tokyo only for like 4 days, to the dismay of most of the students. But Tokyo was fantastic, yet the whole travel was amazing. And we get to see great architecture. And one of the pieces, or what I was talking about, is this Miho Museum,
I see. I see.
which was built into the mountain. And and the mountain was built back. And that was a time when I looked at it and I was like, IMP's work, this is phenomenal. I want to learn. I actually want to learn how to get clients like this. That was what I was thinking.
I see.
Building buildings. Yeah. How do you get a project like this? And
Yeah.
that's when, after MIT, which was also a different kind of career building or kind of profession building experience, I wanted to look at, okay, I want to actually not only theorize and conceptualize, but realize buildings and cultural buildings.
Yeah. Well, what's the answer to that
started
question? What's the answer to that question, Hiroshi? How do you get great clients like that? What's the secret?
The secret, a lot of hard work. It's about personality and relationship, and that's true of architecture in general. But and building a body of work. But I think for myself, I don't know if, probably there'll be many answers and there are overlaps of that. But I think the way we sought out, and I sought out IMP, was that I wanted to learn how he was doing it, learn from a mentor. And then what we did was my partner also worked for IMP. This is from about 2000. I worked for them about 2000 to 2012. He was at some point at the height of his game, was the museum guy, or one of the great architects practicing. And it was an education. It was the school of IMP. And we were lucky because it was the twilight of his career. He had kind of sold his partnership, kind of semi-retired, and he was picking and choosing all these projects. And they were mostly museum projects, which he always said didn't make money, although I didn't believe it. But, so he was working on the Deutsche Historic Museum, which he started with Gerhard Schroeder. And then he was working on Mudam, the Luxembourg Museum, Modern Art Museum. And then he was working also on the Suzhou Art Museum, which is kind of his hometown, or a family hometown. This is a UNESCO old cultural city outside of Shanghai. And then he was working on the Museum of Islamic Art, which I worked on for him. So that was, I sought it out, and we learned, and it wasn't about the actual design so much as the practice, how to read clients. He knew things before the clients knew what they wanted. I assumed it was because of his notoriety or his success or his age, and all that is part of it, but he was amazing at reading clients, putting people in place that would help him, meaning getting the right talent around him at the right time. But he was not afraid to cut. He was ruthless in some ways too. I think you have to be. You know,
Of course.
There are times when they're like, "What has he done for me lately?" kind of thing. So we're like, "Whoa, okay." So, but you know, to be at that point in his career, and I'm sure he went through a lot. You know, just from hearing about the Louvre and what he went through with from Mitterrand and then Chirac, right? The experiences were quite amazing, and that's the education we got, and that's somehow put us in a level where we could understand. And I was working on the Museum of Islamic Art, and I was his representative. And this is a time when, you know, Qatar Museum Authority, and like it was starting to boom, and that was the first major project in the Middle East, and you know, in some ways, international standard. And I was there alone dealing with a lot of issues, and I learned very quickly. And I learned how to do it. And I was meeting the emir one day and meeting with 70 engineers the next day. And there were over 1,000 laborers, and there were labor issues and whatnot. And we ran out of nails for nail guns one day. And then I would have to fly to Italy, you know, to look at the Forte de Marmi, to look at the processing of some stone, or go to Burgundy to pick up the stone, or, you know, so it was a little bit of a crazy time, but I learned how to do it. But I also learned that it's a relationship thing. Right. It's handling clients, learning how to read clients, back channeling, all of that, because it's a tough business, as we all know. Yeah.
So let's talk about your relationships with a couple of your clients and the kind of projects that you have developed. We will come to the work with Richard Serra, whom I'm sure must not have been, well, I don't know whether he was easy to work with or not. We'll come to that. But let's start with your...
not easy to work with.
Not easy,
but a pleasure to work with.
Well, yeah. But let's start with Mu Xin. The artist, the sort of artist, writer, poet, philosopher from China, with whom you built
and the U.S.
U.S. Yes, of course, he migrated to the U.S. and he lived in New York. He
lived in Forest Hills and then Jackson Heights.
So the New York area. Now Mu Xin, you built this museum for him for these amazing drawings that he did, which have a kind of an abstracted Chinese painting quality with the brushwork.
Yes.
And then his writings, you know, which are these minuscule writings, you know, really, really, really small. I haven't seen them. I've only seen them online. But I understand that he was doing these writings while he was in prison, right?
House arrest or
incarcerated. Incarcerated during the Cultural Revolution. So you built this museum for him, and you worked closely with him. I guess you worked with him mostly when he was already in the U.S.
Actually, we only met when he was back in China, and I'll tell you a little bit about him in terms of he was an amazing figure, very interesting, and it's a single artist museum, which was it's a little bit unusual. He came from a very good family, and his hometown was where this museum is in Wuzhen.
Right.
Wuzhen is a household name for most Chinese tourists. It's a very big tourist destination. It's a canal town, one of the few, or many canal towns, but one of the few that's done very well, that connects into the network of waterways of the Grand Canal from Beijing to Hangzhou. And so there are many canal towns, but not many done well. But this one was successfully restored and then programmed as kind of a tourist destination. There's about 1,200 beds, and then it's kind of a living city. Okay. In an interesting way, and it's kind of, you know, you're going back in time a little bit. this was the town that he grew up in before that it became famous. And he came from a very good family. His father was a wealthy merchant, but died very early when he was a young boy. So he was brought up by his mother.
But is that why he wasn't put into house arrest during the Cultural
No,
Revolution?
he essentially, I think there are many things, but he was older. He was a Renaissance man. He would write. He would actually make his own music. No one really knew about that. He would actually sew his own clothes. He was more famous for his writing, but he always thought of himself as an artist. And his short stories is what really generated his popularity. It was first available in Taiwan, and then it became available throughout China. And the younger generation started to pick up in his writings. His writing of short stories, fiction, but very almost real, first-person narration, and very observant and cheeky and kind of the day kind of conversations, and sometimes fantastical also. So very interesting, very learned person. And he taught himself history, Asian history, ancient Chinese history, but also Western history. And he loved reading Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Oscar Wilde. And so going back to your question, this is someone who, when he, in the 80s, when in China, where there's a big immigration, there's a diaspora of artists or aspiring artists who came to the States to practice their art and seek their fortune in the States. He was the mentor, because he's a little bit older, to all these young artists. And he would teach them once a week in his home about Asian history or music or Western literature, or, and so he would have these seminars. And some of these artists became very famous later on. And they've all subsequently, in the 2000s, whatever, there's a huge boom in China right now for very famous artists. Like these are contemporaries of Ai Weiwei, Saiko Chang, people like that, very successful household names. And they wanted to celebrate Mu Xin. And they wanted to build this museum. And they actually had worked on a project that we worked on for IMP doing art. And so that's how that connection.
That's how you got that one. But let's go back to the Cultural Revolution for 1 minute and talk about his life there. Because he was writing these things, many of the things that are displayed. I think half of them are in Yale, but half of them are in this museum. And they were sort of secret writings, right? I mean, he was not allowed to do them.
They're prison notes. We call them prison notes.
Prison notes.
So they're actually written on paper that was for confession. So you're supposed to do your confession.
Oh, really? Because these are quite big paper. How big are the papers?
They're like A4,
A4,
letter size.
And then he sewed them into his clothes?
So to hide it, because he's not supposed to be writing about things. He's not supposed to, this is a cultural revolution. You're not supposed to be literate. You're not supposed to be learned. You're not supposed to be doing art. It's decadent, things like that. He was in house arrest and then incarcerated in another area, but in a confined space, and made to do confessions every day. And he was wearing a prison garb. And essentially, he wrote in these papers that he secretly kind of kept stories, conversations with his favorite artists, or, with Tolstoy, or there's some writings about, with Oscar Wilde, he would be writing a letter, or like Chinese philosophers. And he would create these spaces in his head. And that was the way he kept himself sane within this incarcerated world that he had.
But I'm also interested in the sewing into the clothes.
Yeah, he had to hide it. They were confiscated.
Did you see how they were sewed into the clothes?
No, we didn't. But so you're right. There's half in the archives of the Yale Art Museum, and then half were donated to the museum that we designed. And we have this one room. It's a very austere room. We use blackened steel panels. And we elevated these coffin boxes. They're like light boxes. And that was what emanates through the room. It's a pretty low ceiling too, so you feel this compression. And we display these pieces, and they rotate them in and out, and so they don't display all of them for conservation purposes. And we created this handle or bar that's like a leather wrap bar. You can lean on it and read it. And they're the tiny little writings, almost like, I don't know, one page is what, 600-700 words. This page would have like thousands of words or characters. And you would have to look at it very carefully. Like my eyes are getting worse. I don't know if I can read it now, but that's how he conserved this paper, wrote, and then he would roll them up and hide them in his prison guard.
That's what you remember. Survived. You remember Marquis de Sade also wrote in prison, right? And he would hide his writings.
That's right. That's right.
As well.
And I'm sure he's read this. Yes.
Oh, I'm sure. Maybe he was.
Oh
my God. Yeah. But now you have described like these black cases that you have created, kind of elevated into this compressed spaces, like these coffins. So we have two interesting. Well, in this case, a metaphor of a coffin.
Yes.
Kind of these floating coffins that you peer into, right? In this compressed space, it's pretty much windowless, right? Isn't it?
Yes.
So talk to me a little bit about, and it sort of replicates the condition of prison to me, and also, a coffin. A coffin is the ultimate prison, right? So it's like a prison within a prison.
I think it kind of is a theme throughout our work is we try to enhance experience or reinterpret experience, and through the architecture and space, make people aware and so we talk about the space and the speed of a space.
Speed of a space? What do you mean speed of a space?
Speed. So speed as in experiential speed or experiential time. So the whole thing, the museum is on the side of this restored canal town, but it's a very modern looking museum, modernist looking museum. It's
very
all
Cornell looking, I might say. It's very Cornell
architectural concrete. But actually the scale of the museum it's actually 60% underwater. It's a three-story building, but we only show 2 stories out of the water, and it looks like a series of volumes floating on the water, intersecting.
Right, yeah.
And it's, we reinterpreted. We went to the canal town. The amazing thing about the canal town, again, about the speed or experiences, the waterway was the lifeline, and so bridges, even though you had proximity to your neighbor on a narrow canal.
Right.
That distance is not the real distance of your proximity. It's audio distance or visual distance. But you have to go down the canal, over the bridge, and come back to visit to be physically with those people. And the idea that we have these devices, spatial experiences, movement, influencing visual cues, even compressed spaces. These are tools that architects use all the time, or non-architects.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think we made an emphasis in and maybe it's Japanese as well, but Cornell background, that how do we enhance an experience through certain devices like the bridge. The bridge was a very important metaphor for us. And the approach this building, the museum over a bridge, and it's not a straight bridge. It jags in the middle, forcing you to stop, look, or alter your movement. And as you come to the entrance plaza and the gift shops outside, because we didn't want to muck up the experience with the gift shop, you come in and you enter the world of Mu Xin. And all these intersecting volumes, different heights, different dimensions, different proportions, have different aspects of his life. And,
and so what went down and what came up? Because a lot of the building is underground, and some things so how do you differentiate that?
And obviously they're different. I mean, museums are pretty complicated things where we have conservation and back of house storage, crate storage.
Sure.
But also, we have this. So it's a 3-story volume, and we have a middle courtyard with a waterfall falling to the basement. And that courtyard fronts a cafe. So the cafe has glass to the waterfall, and you look through the waterfall to this very vertical concrete wall that's textured. At night, the water lights it up and the water shimmers on this concrete wall. It's a beautiful experience. But that actually was a courtyard that had a temporary gallery, another literature multifunction gallery, and then a second temporary gallery that was connected vertically throughout. So you would hook into a circuit that goes up and down, but you can go backwards as well. And so the idea was that the temporary galleries can be all combined with the cafe even to create a show. So there was a show about Nietzsche. You know, anything related to the artist. He loved Nietzsche, you know. And so they did you know, some sort of association with the museum and his foundation. And they brought his writings and a lot of his personal artifacts, and they created a show of Mu Xin and Nietzsche. And they transformed that temporary gallery, which is all underground with that one courtyard.
I see. So we've talked a little bit about the architecture, but I want to talk a little bit about something you started to mention about, you know, cross-culturality. And internationality and locality. And, you know, so you were born in Japan, but then you grew up in the US, then you sort of went back to Japan and you got a partner there, then you came back to the US, and then you are working with this, you know, Chinese artist, but who actually lived most of his life in, well, senior adult, later life in the US, but then went back. And then you're working with I.M. Pei, who also has this, you know, well, most people would say just an international profile, but he also has a, you know,
a pretty broad domestic profile too. I mean, domestic in the US, yeah.
Domestic in the US, but only much later in life in China, a little bit, you know.
Yes, very little in China. Yeah.
Very little in China, but you have your own biography is interesting as well, you know, in terms of.
I am who I am, and you know, and I'm sorry I interrupted. It's like it's I guess it's by no accident that I wanted to practice internationally. It was important, and I had the opportunity through education, through upbringing, through some goals that I had that were supported by family, especially my wife and daughter, but also my parents, through intentionality, that there is this kind of international practice. But I guess what I wanted to say is that architecture is becoming more and more global, yet also more and more local. You know,
I mean, I'd say that as the question of the relationship between abstraction and translation. All right. So, I mean, often enough architects, you know, those of us with a modernist training, certainly a Cornell training or whatever, put a lot of faith in abstraction and, you know, cleaning up as abstraction as a device to bridge across cultures, right?
It was a time and place where you aspired to what the future may have and what it may hold. And then there was postmodernism, and then there's postmodernism, and then where are we right now? But
I wouldn't call your work postmodern at all.
No, I mean, but what I was trying to say is that even I.M. at the end of his career, they would call him regional modernist, or, you know, the understanding of, I don't know what that means either, but but just somehow, and it may be just the framing more than the actual reality, but trying to take something from the culture of building, the history of architecture, and the civilization or social cultural kind of local influences, and interpret that in some way that influences their architecture or, you know, design. And
I mean, let's talk about language. I mean, you're trying to, you talked extensively about, you know, Wuhan, its history, its sort of local architecture, how it's been somewhat restored, you know, even though it's for tourist reasons. And And I mean, so, but then there's a certain translation of that kind of architectural vocabulary into your vocabulary, right?
Yeah.
And I remember, I was listening to some YouTube video or something. You were talking about a conversation you were having with Mu Xin, and he was speaking in Chinese, in Mandarin, I think, or Cantonese. I'm not sure. Mandarin probably.
In Mandarin.
Yeah. And from what I understand, your Mandarin is not very good.
Very, very little.
Yeah.
My French is better.
Your French is better. Mine too. But let's just say your architectural language, architectural Mandarin. Do you see your job as part of is translating, let's say, architectural Mandarin, or do you? How do you see this work? We talk about context, we talk about site, we talk about, you're talking about bridges and so on. But what is all that?
I think I'm not high on signifiers or iconic kind of function and form, or not function and form, but like I'm more about experience, I think. And I think those things, of course, you can't divorce it from aesthetic devices, but I think you can get away from the pure kind of embedding a meaning through aesthetics only because you're going through experience. And experience, I mean, you can't divorce the two. I don't know if that makes sense, but the idea that when we looked at the village, it was very small scale. We looked at the experience of the canal. We looked at the experience of these two-story buildings and how some overhangs the view of the canal and the proximity to the inner road, which was not the canal, started to create these sectional qualities that were very interesting to us, and the adjacent building next door. And people's lives were connected through these networks, through this landscape of this canal. And that's what we started to look at. And we wanted to then say, what if this was Mu Xin Village, or Mu Xin, a museum of Mu Xin landscape? And what are those experiences? How do we connect them? How do we slow speed down or make people aware of something through surface, tactility, sound, or through visual breaks between rooms, or the coffin room, or what we call the prison notes room, where it's windowless and darker than anything else. And we have this black steel and the lighting is controlled through the showcase. And then there's actually a room right adjacent to that where you have a break. And it's just 3 steps and a view of the landscape. And so we would juxtapose those things. So, we work internationally in a lot of places, in the Middle East, in Japan, in China, in the US. We haven't done anything in Europe or South America, and we'd love to work in Africa. But even in those places, there's specific cultures, specific site contextualization, there's specific construction methodologies, the specific social, cultural, and end user specific needs and stakeholder. And I hate those terms because they're used a lot.
Yeah.
But there are, you're working for a clientele, many clientels, many clients, those that use the space, those that identify with the space or give it meaning. Yeah. Or those who run the place or own the place, Yeah.
No, I agree. But does it make a difference to you whether you're working in Japan or China versus Qatar or somewhere else?
Attitude-wise, or
no, just in terms of ability to translate into architecture.
So I may not answer it in the way you're asking, but I would say there's 2 things to that. One is the practice, and every client is different, but there's definitely things that happen in Japan, and that's why I like designing in Japan certain things. And there's certain things in China where you can't do anywhere else in the world, because the willpower, the scale, or the labor that you can, that building, every piece of concrete, wood, was hand chiseled. I mean, hand wire brushed, watered wire brushed, and we didn't replace or we didn't reuse any wood. That's crazy. And like, you know, and each piece is in and out. There's a rule, there's a game rule about how do you start a joint from one place, what's in, what's out, how do you break the rule, you know? So like to have that done somewhere in the States, it would have cost 6 times more money. It would have never have been built. Yeah. So those are practice kind of things. But I guess what you're trying to say is contextually and in terms of historical significance, or
just emotional resonance as an artist.
Emotional
architect.
resonance. I think emotional resonance, I feel like we're very good at, only because we, again, about this, I think there's some human innate quality. It doesn't have to be cultural. Learned. Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn, in this last part of our conversation to your work, talking about working with clients. Let's talk about working with clients with famous big egos. We can talk about, the cube. I don't know what it's called, the box that you designed for Richard Serra's London Cross. These two massive pieces of steel, laid one on top of each other. And to a certain extent, from what I understand, this box that you designed to hold them is considered to be part of the artwork. It's not the box that holds the artwork, but the box is part of the artwork. So
that's right. Yeah.
In a sense, I guess one would argue that it is authored as much by Richard Serra as by you. So the project is this box which holds these two pieces of steel, and it's made out of wood, burnt wood, burnt black. So it's got this blackish color, and I suppose it will weather more. And then it's got this. The roof is essentially a skylight with north lights, I think, coming in, or so modulated north light. Yeah. So what is the difference between these two projects, the Mu Xin Museum and working with Richard Serra? One is designed to contain art, and one is, in a sense, an extension of the art itself, right? So what was the difference in working with Richard Serra on this compared to the other one? Or was it more or less the same process?
I mean, looking back, it's definitely a different process and different people involved. The Richard Serra project came to us because I worked with Richard before that in Doha.
Mm-hmm.
So after the Museum of Islamic Art, I was tasked with designing the peninsula behind the museum. And this is when they were trying to get a site-specific commissioned piece of art to celebrate the museum.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where Richard Serra came in, and then I helped. This is during IM's kind of latter years. He was about 88 already. So then I was asked to design the peninsula, and he wanted to work with me on a platform for a minaret type, one of his tallest sculpture ever. Right? And I think that relationship and the success of that project, in his eyes, I hope, led us to this new project. And I think the similarity in these two things is the first thing is, as a preeminent artist of our time, I would think that most people wouldn't argue Richard Serra's position. He has a tremendous amount of contractual control over how his art is displayed.
Of course.
How it's, he has to approve.
Right of first refusal, this, that, and the other.
Like if, they want to sell back, he can buy it back, he has to say it's right or not. And so, like you said, he is very much someone who's done smaller pieces at the beginning. When he scaled up, that's when his notoriety developed, and he's starting to deal with space. But he always wanted to deal with space, even from his early early days, Federal Plaza, where he cut off that plaza with that arc. Famously, he had that argument and worked with Frank Gehry, in Bilbao, and he didn't like the museum because there's a lot of cladding, but a lot of gymnastics. But that museum's amazing, I love it. For his piece, the space is not great, but I think what he appreciated was that we worked to enhance the experience of his pieces that he couldn't do. And so we were his partner. And as you said, contractually, when the piece is done and he says, this is great and approved and it's built, that's the end of the contract for him too. And so it's actually the art piece. And so after the Museum of Islamic Art Park, where we did the pier for him, we get this call from the Gagosian Gallery, which is his agent. And we actually have the owner of the art piece is a major collector, and Richard Serra is the artist. And we didn't know it was Richard Serra at first. We were going through this qualification kind of interview process. We're giving them our past projects and whatnot, and then we found out that it was this huge collector, and we found out it was Richard Serra. And then I get a book from Richard, and it's actually we went out and looked at the site together. And there's a piece that was already shown, the London Cross. So you're right, it's two pieces of steel, it's weathering steel, but it's an interior piece. It's 40 feet long, 7.5 feet tall, 2.5 inches thick. And one is balanced on the other in a cruciform, wrapped in a gallery. And it was first shown in the Gagosian in London, and they built a gallery inside of a gallery to house that piece. And so they built the walls as they rigged the sculpture. They're building the walls to support the sculpture. So the sculpture is actually just wedged into the wall, or the wall is wedged towards the sculpture. So they jack the walls, and we have to go through the same process, pre-finished parts in jacking the walls.
But this time your box is not in a museum; it's standing in a wide open field.
That was the new thing, and it's a very simple thing where the bottom piece is a diagonal. So you have two galleries, you have two entrances. And then the top piece that bisects your both galleries with something above your head. But that was it. And the client, who's a major collector, had never seen the piece either. And so and I hadn't seen the piece, but I get this book. It's about the London Cross. And I've seen Kitty Hawk, I've seen other pieces, from Richard, and talking to Richard, he's like, all right, let's go and look at the site. So they picked me up one day. We went up to Bedford. This is in Westchester, and the grounds of this estate have very significant other pieces of art by other major artists and two other Richard Serras. And we picked this case right at the bottom of this hill, where we knew roughly it was going to be a pavilion, like a folly, and that was it. But there was nothing else predicted. And we walked out there and we're staking out, like, roughly how big do you think it is? This is the sculpture or not? And Richard, he would be like, what do you think? I'm like, I think it should move this way or that way. And we just kind of came to an idea that this is where the place is going to be. The pavilion is going to be, and it's going to be a box. And that was it. And then I was shipped off, and then I was given a book by Richard, and it's like, it says Japanese joinery. It's a Japanese joinery book. He was really into Japanese joinery. He's like, I think this building should be wood. And
why?
I was like,
why wood?
Well, the surrounding buildings on this estate, there was a barn, and then there's a field house.
It does look like a barn. The box that you have made does look like a barn.
But it's all reclaimed wood. And he's like, what about reclaimed wood? I'm like, I don't want to do a reclaimed wood barn. But
why was he interested in reclaimed wood? The steel artist.
I don't know. He just
why
said
not
it
concrete?
Should be wood. He just said it should be wood, and I think he knew the client. And the client, it's an interior piece, right? But for me, I was like, it cannot be reclaimed wood. We cannot do reclaimed wood. And I was thinking about it.
Why not? Why didn't you think it should be reclaimed wood?
I mean, I like reclaimed wood, but this is Richard Serra's sculpture. It would lose to that sculpture.
Of course.
It wouldn't stand up to it. And the power of what I think why he likes us is we are intentionally out of his way, but can hold our weight in terms of the experience that's worthy for that sculpture. It's not dressing and, and I think that's why we're working on another project with him right now, a very big pavilion for a very big sculpture. But again, we think about the experience of this piece and we think about highlighting or heightening that experience from approach, from view, from entry, from light, from contrast of light, all these things.
One of the things was light, of course, and you had this little model that you took on site, I think, or maybe somebody made a model, and it had, I thought, beautiful light coming from the top, and it made these patterns which were in complex dialogue with the cross of the two pieces. But he didn't want that. He just wanted diffuse light, no shadows. Yeah.
No shadows. And the problem was the client wanted to have a view out. And in the end, we compromised with that sawtooth, but also we put 2 windows in, which we made some expensive rolling shutters and a folding shutter, and integrating it into this hydrated lime wall.
Yeah.
But we made these skylights that were shrouded too. So from the outside and from the vista approaching the site, you would never see what's above. You just see this kind of 4-sided cube, and it's all black. And like you said, it's a charred wood. Yeah. It's a very Japanese technique, this charred wood. Yeah. It's a rain screen though, actually. It's a concrete building. It's actually very environmentally stable.
Yeah. It's a good way. That's a great wood. Yeah, because it enhances the life of the wood, it
well, the beauty of it is the wood patinas.
Yeah.
But his sculpture, which is entombed inside, and which we worked really hard to finish the building and leave parts of it open so we can rig it and build the inside and then clad it before it became too humid, too rainy and whatnot. So that the mill scale, a lot of the sculptures come out of Germany. There's mill scale on it, and that's a protective coating. Once it starts to weather, then it peels off, and then the orange oxidation starts to happen from brown to orange, right?
Right.
But this sculpture is an indoor piece, and we wanted to keep it as pristine as possible and no weather. And so
talk to me a little bit about the colors, over here. So the piece is a pretty dark gray, almost black, right? Yes. But your interior walls are all white.
All white, yeah.
All white, but the exterior is black.
That's right.
Right. So you're talking about making a building which can almost compete with the Serra piece, right? Holding its own. So talk to me about the black outside, how you go in, the white on the inside, and then the black of the piece.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, the white is a leftover of the white box in the galleries. You go into the Gagosian,
your standard,
wherever. It's a standard white box.
Yeah.
And it was built as a standard white box when it was first shown. It just didn't have a wrapper around it or the skylight that we designed. And so that was already a given, but the gallery experience when it was first exhibited was maybe for 2 months. And so the materials used then are not the materials we use for our London Cross. The reason why is this has to stand for 20, 40, 50 years or more.
Right.
And so the idea, and it's a radiating fan. If the temperature swings, and we did these studies, if our generator, we have an emergency generator hooked up to a redundant cooling system with blue duct feeding air, dehumidified air as well, underneath the ground into this pavilion, is so that the climate is somewhat stable. And it doesn't have to be that stable, but the problem is not the sculpture, it's the walls.
Yeah.
And the sculpture would expand and contract maybe a 1/4 inch, depending on the swing of it. Right. And so what we did was use hydrated lime that especially made in Europe, that's very hard, that's very dimensionally stable, that we don't need construction drawings. And we designed it with a high performance plasterboard, a shore hardness 80 neoprene pad, 3 layers of orient strand board, and then we jacked it all together with a construction joint that was caulked at the corners.
Right.
And so it was, it was a choreographed experience just to get that white wall to work. And as far as we know, there's no cracks right now.
Okay.
The outside is where we could play.
Yeah.
And, and like I, before, it's like, why reclaim wood? I don't, it's going to look like the barn next door.
Yeah.
And this is a folly. And we positioned the folly, and we did these light studies using Climate Studio and the times of the year that the client would be there with guests, or in the morning when he would wake up and go, and to make sure that it was optimally positioned so there's no shadows on the sculpture. That's what the artist wanted. So it has this canted kind of position on the bottom of this hill that we cut up, created a curtain drain, created a little swale around to make sure there's no water coming in. But it's really at the bottom of this hill. And all you see is this black cladding with 2 doors, 2 barn doors or pocket doors. And the black cladding is this beautiful akoya, charred akoya. In Japan, they use sugi, which is cedar. And you see it on the seaside where it's homemade, actually. It's very craft oriented. It's a folk craft. They've done it for hundreds of years. They just torch the boards. And it's really more.
Did you torch the
chefs.
boards, or did you get them already?
No, we went to Houston. we went to Delta Millworks. Delta, that's a shout out. There's 2 companies in the US, Nakamoto Forestry in Seattle, somewhere in Washington, and Delta, which we thought were good. And we went a year and a half, 2 years before, and said, hey, we have a 22-foot pavilion. We want a 12-inch board that can run 22 feet. And they're like, give us some time, we'll find it for you. They couldn't find it, so we had to cut it. But it's still only 2 lengths. And we cut it at a position where it bisects, it feels like the London Cross,
Oh, okay, So
when you look at it, the charring is called a gator. They call it gator, their branding. It's a very highly charred piece. And it's quite wide. And so, but it's very dimensionally stable. So it has this like crackled texture to it. And each one, depending on the sunlight, sometimes looks silver. And it's beautiful texture. And it reminded me actually of Richard's drawings, his work on paper, especially his large drawings, where, I think the only one that's on, one of the permanent ones were maybe Dia. He has that one room. It's a huge drawing of the 2 walls. Very thick ink, right? On Japanese paper. And so, the texture was important, the strength of that texture, the board widths, and then we use these rivets. And the rivets, you can't rivet in the middle because you're going to split the wood. We have to have careful patterning. And what we wanted to use were these forged Japanese iron nails that actually were used in all these seaside
but those
buildings.
Are too expensive.
Well, they rust, and the reason why they work is they rust and expand, and then they grip. And so you always see a rust stain, but that's when they're working. And then there were $30-something thousand for doing it. So we couldn't do it. But we thought, the client probably didn't, would not go for this, the rusting. So we came up with blackened stainless steel spanner bolts, which are, the 2-prong bolts. We made them align each bolt, and it has this beautiful riveted pattern. Some photos you see when the snow hit, it would accumulate on the rivet. So you see the snow riveting on it, and it's quite beautiful. And so we were very happy with the cladding, and it'll patina. So over the years, it'll turn grayer. The sculpture hopefully will stay the same.
How old is the building now?
2.5 years. 3 years.
Is it starting to weather nicely?
I haven't been out there with COVID and but we have no complaints and the client seems very happy.
Well, fantastic. I will look. I have never been there. But it's private. You can't go there, right? Nobody can.
But you have a lot of friends. You probably could.
Okay, I'll call you up next time.
But the last one we're doing will be an art park, in an art park. So, Florida.
Okay. Oh, Florida. Okay. All right. I'll look forward to when that is done. And
you can always go to Doha.
Yeah, of course. Doha, I can go. Well, we have a bunch of really amazing Serras over here in Seattle.
I know.
In the Olympic Sculpture Park. Yeah.
Weissman Freddy.
Yeah. Weissman Freddy. That's right. Yeah. So it's a beautiful building. Well, congratulations for all this beautiful work.
Thank you.
And I've really enjoyed looking at all the things that you have done and seeing how you are sort of both continuing a certain tradition of working, which certainly is in I think the IMP way of working, but transforming it in a very specific way and doing some beautiful work.
Yes, Vikram. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
As well.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.